Okay, we'll be getting started now. Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar on competitive employment incentives that may impact the engagement of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are delighted that Amy Westling and Denise Cartwright accepted the invitation and will be providing information on today's topic. Our presenters are wonderful collaborators and apt to share what they know. Attending today's webinar are participants representing our community colleges and professionals from a range of agencies, including but not limited to America's Job Centers, the Department of Rehabilitation, Disability Rights of California, partnerships with industry, regional centers, and the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, to name just a handful of institutions that are with us. Thank you for joining us, and please allow me to address a few items before we introduce the presenters. I am Will Francis, Project Director for Post-Secondary Education at the Tarjan Center. The Tarjan Center at UCLA is a federally designated Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities and your host for today's webinar. Support for today's webinar comes from the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office through a contract that enables us to provide technical assistance and training to California community colleges, disabled students, programs, and services who are working to provide equitable supports and services, as well as opportunities for students with disabilities, including students with intellectual disabilities and autism. We provided a PowerPoint for today's call, and we recommend that you have that document handy. A number of our colleagues are unable to attend today's webinar, but ask for a recording of the proceedings. In order to facilitate access to a clean recording of the webinar, we have muted all calls. Please take a look at the bottom right side of your computer where you should find a chat or text box. We will be sure to address your questions and welcome you to submit as many questions as arise into that chat box. Now I'll give a few minutes here. To ensure that we know that this feature is working, can you please take a moment to insert the name of your institution into the chat box? Thank you. The purpose of the webinar is to provide California community colleges and community partners with information on two newly authorized programs, namely the Competitive Integrated Employment Incentives Program and the Paid Internship Program for individuals that are regional center consumers. There are approximately 7,000 students currently attending our community colleges that have an intellectual or developmental disability. In the wake of calls for greater accountability for student outcomes, our colleges have implemented the Student Success Support Program, or SSSP, equity plans, and many districts are using adult education block grants to promote student engagement and success. As most of you know, these and other efforts were designed to move students in and through higher education and to improve the outcomes of students with and without disabilities. Through our College to Career programs, we know that students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, are accessing credit and non-credit courses and are completing certificates, and some are pursuing degrees. Some of our students who are not interested in a degree or transfer use the education and workforce development training from the colleges to prepare for employment. A number of our students are enrolled in career technical education courses, and others need a pathway through the college to employment. For the transition from college to employment to occur, some of these students will be at your doorsteps. The information we are providing today is designed to highlight the importance of forging collaborative relationships across the campuses, between disabled students programs and services, and your career education offices, and in the community with adult service providers. Most of our students with IDD at the community colleges are supported by one or more adult service providers. If not, you should connect them with a provider. If they are receiving services like tailored day services through their regional center, or if students and your institution are receiving assistance under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, you will want to help make the connection so that the resources we will be discussing today could be used to help students transition from college to competitive integrated employment. I'm hoping we will have a robust discussion about these opportunities today, and that you will use the text box to ask questions about the potential that exists. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our presenters. Amy Wessling is currently the Interim Executive Director of the Association of Regional Center Agencies, also known as ARCA. She joined ARCA in 2012 and has focused on services for children at risk for developmental disabilities, accessing health insurance funding for autism services, and funding needs of California's developmental services system. Prior to that, she worked for Alta Regional Center, where she coordinated the movement of individuals with developmental disabilities from institutional to community settings. And she worked for Central Valley Regional Center, where she oversaw service coordination in rural Merced and Mariposa counties. Amy also worked for Disability Rights of California, where she advocated for individuals with developmental disabilities in the Central Valley. Ms. Wessling earned a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's of public administration from California State University, Fresno. Denise Cartwright is the chief of the Work Services section at the State Department of Developmental Services. As chief, she oversees the policy and programs within the developmental disability system to support employment outcomes for youth and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. A primary responsibility of the Work Services section is to develop collaborative relationships with agencies such as the Department of Rehabilitation, the Employment Developmental Department, and the Department of Education. The Work Services section has been working on projects to identify barriers, including policies, laws, and regulations to effect changes and to improve competitive integrated employment outcomes. A current focus of the Work Services section is to implement the Competitive Integrated Employment Blueprint in partnership with the Departments of Rehabilitation and Education over the next 5 years to improve competitive integrated employment outcomes for youth and adults with IDD. Denise has more than 25 years of experience working in the field of developmental disabilities and 18 years with the Department of Developmental Services. She began her career by helping a local sheltered workshop to close its doors and to move all the consumers into competitive integrated employment in their local communities. For Denise, the power of a job to change the life of an individual has been the source of inspiration that fuels her passion to create the conditions for more individuals to attain competitive integrated employment. It is my pleasure to welcome you, Amy and Denise. Thank you for being willing to share the wealth of your knowledge with the colleges and their partners. And now, here is Amy Wessling.
Thank you so much, Will. So, as Will mentioned, my name is Amy Wessling. I work with the Association of Regional Center Agencies, and I'm pleased to be joining you today and appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to discuss this important endeavor with you. Okay. Okay, so today we'll be discussing a couple of important topics. As a result of participating in the webinar, participants will be able to describe the purpose of the Competitive Integrated Employment Incentive, and also participants will be able to describe the roles of vendors, employers, and the Regional Center in implementing the Paid Internship Program. So before we go much further, I want to talk about the role of regional centers in supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's important to remember that California has a very specific definition of developmental disability, which differs from the definition that we may be familiar with through the school system or through the federal government. So under California's definition, An individual must have a condition that arises prior to the age of 18, which is either attributable to intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, autism, epilepsy, or what we call the fifth category, which is a condition similar to intellectual disability or requiring treatment similar to intellectual disability. It's also important to remember that a diagnosis alone doesn't make an individual eligible for regional center services. The individual must also have a substantial disability, which means that they have challenges in at least 3 of 7 life areas, including self-care, communication, mobility, self-direction, and the like. So regional centers support individuals from birth until death. And today's focus will be on how regional centers support people with IDD in the workforce and to enter the workforce. First and foremost, it's important to know that regional centers have an overall goal of helping adults to be as independent as possible. This also includes a goal towards employment. Individuals are entitled to services that it is determined through their individual program plan that they require. And this is a process of individualized goal setting and needs determination. Through the individual program plan, an individual's interdisciplinary team meets and discusses the individual's current functioning levels, the individual's goals, and the services and supports that will enable the individual to reach those goals. Following that, the regional center engages in resource matching, either helping to match the person with an available community resource to meet the identified need, or by developing a resource to meet needs where no resources exist. We'll talk more about that later. So as I mentioned, each individual has a planning process. We call it the individual program plan, and when we think about how to best support an individual, we first identify the needs that that individual has and the needs that arise from that individual's disability. The next thing we talk about is how to meet those needs. What services and supports does that individual need in order to help them achieve their goals? And we look to things like natural and generic supports. Natural supports are those things that are available in all of our communities. So social relationships that form organically among family members, among friends, and among community groups. Those are natural supports. Generic supports are those supports that are available to other groups who need them and are publicly funded typically. So those are things like special education and SSI and Medi-Cal and the like. We also must look to, regional centers must consider the availability of natural and generic supports because they're required to utilize those things first. The next thing we consider is individual choice. So once a need has been identified and the availability of natural and generic supports has been considered, then we move on to what is the individual's choice of service providers, if there are several that could meet the individual's needs. And of course, we always consider cost effectiveness as well. So over time, the federal government has pushed policy in disability services closer and closer to a focus on competitive integrated employment. And a lot of people ask why this is or how this has been done. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about that. About 50 years ago, the first regional centers opened their doors. In fact, we celebrated the anniversary of the first 2 regional centers last year. And this was done at a time, regional centers were established at a time when there was no federal funding available for community services. The federal government at that time was funding only institutional care. And so the idea that services could be provided in the community was revolutionary. And at that time, community meant anything outside of a state-run institutional setting. So we saw very large congregate settings established in the community. And those things were new and different and amazing at that time. Since then, we've seen over time that things have changed radically. So we're moving to smaller and smaller settings with more and more focus on individualized care and needs assessment. And several things at the federal level have driven us in this direction. First was the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which said that individuals with disabilities had the right to accommodations and had the right to access public resources. Next, in 1999, the US Supreme Court found in the Olmstead decision that individuals should not be placed in institutional care unless they really needed that level of support. But the federal government continued to push us even further. In 2011, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the federal agency that funds many of the disability services in the community today, said that pre-vocational services should be time limited. Now, pre-vocational services are those services that we developed to help people transition from school to work. They were services that helped to teach people work readiness skills, such as we used to call them soft skills. And they were things like how to interact with an employer, how to be on time for work, how to interact with coworkers, and those sorts of things. And the federal government said in 2011 that those services and placement in those services should not be an end spot, but instead should be used as a path towards competitive integrated employment. In the years that followed, the Department of Justice took action in several states, including Oregon and Rhode Island. And the Department of Justice said that in alignment with the Olmstead decision that we discussed just a couple of minutes ago, that in addition to that being applicable to individuals and where they lived, it also applied to individuals and where they spent their day. So that individuals should not only be allowed to live outside of institutional settings, they should be allowed to spend their day outside of institutional or institution-like settings. Then in 2014, we had the Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule, which requires that services that are funded through a state's Developmental Disability Services Agency, which in California would flow through the regional centers, as well as other services for other populations like the aging population, that those services should support integration into the community and should permit individuals to access their communities to the same degree as people without disabilities or who weren't in that aging population. And then finally, we had the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act in 2014, which required that we take a whole new look at the way workforce services are provided in this country, not just for individuals with disabilities, but also for everybody else who took place in workforce development services. It required that we look more closely before we place people into sub-minimum wage settings. It required that services developed for workforce development services, that those services become not only physically accessible to people with disabilities, but also programmatically accessible, so that they demonstrate their ability and their efforts towards serving people with all levels of abilities. So those are some of the initiatives at the federal level that are really driving this conversation. And then there's been initiatives at the state level that have driven this conversation as well. So in 2011, the state developed a new service model called Tailored Day Services. And this was an opportunity for individuals to receive individualized services, sometimes with the goal of competitive integrated employment, sometimes with the goal of participation in post-secondary education. But the goal was really to serve those people who weren't fitting well into traditional day service or work service programs, and to help them meet their identified individual goals. In 2013, The governor of California signed the state's Employment First policy. And the state's Employment First policy says, it is the policy of the state that opportunities for integrated competitive employment shall be given the highest priority for working age individuals with developmental disabilities, regardless of the severity of their disabilities. So it required that we as a state take a look at each individual and really say, it's our preference that people find work and that we support them to do that. And let's try to think of creative and innovative ways to make that happen for them. There was also the California Employment Consortium for Youth and Young Adults with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. This program ran for 5 years from 2011 through 2016, and it continues today through a partnership in employment federal grant. And really the aim of this project was to get everybody in the same room, to get education, rehabilitation, developmental services, employment development department, and several other groups in the same room to talk about how can we partner with one another to advance the interest of competitive integrated employment for youth in California as they exit the school system. In 2016, the California Competitive Integrated Employment Blueprint was posted, and this really outlined that work. It outlined how the Department of Rehabilitation, the California Department of Education, and the Department of Developmental Services would work together at the state level to coordinate better outcomes for employment. But it also highlighted the need for those entities to cooperate at the local level through the regional centers, school districts, and Department of Rehab district offices to coordinate at that local level to find solutions that worked for them in order to better enhance the ability of the systems to take an individual from school and move them to competitive integrated employment. The chart on the right highlights some of the challenges that we have here in California in terms of individuals with developmental disabilities achieving employment outcomes. You'll see that according to data available from the Department of Developmental Services, that roughly 13% of individuals of working age with developmental disabilities served by regional centers are working at this time. And you'll see that we've been hovering around that same percentage for quite some time. You'll also see that wages for individuals with developmental disabilities have been hovering around the same range for some time, although they are starting to grow, and in 2014 we did see an uptick. But it's still not a living wage, and we continue to try to find ways to enhance that. So while I've got this chart up, I did want to mention that we do have some data limitations in the state of California in terms of trying to pinpoint exactly what percentage of people are working, as well as trying to pinpoint exactly how much they're being paid per hour. But these are efforts that are that work is going towards to try to alleviate them and try to make the data better. Okay. So I mentioned that one of the planning considerations when we look to develop an individual program plan for someone who's expressed an interest in employment is that we have to consider natural and generic support. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the natural and generic supports that are available to assist individuals with developmental disabilities in achieving competitive integrated employment. First and foremost, we can never underestimate the power of social networks. So just like many of us got our first job or first lead on a job through a friend or a family member, many times individuals with developmental disabilities have that opportunity as well. Second, informal supports. We can all probably look back in our careers and pinpoint those people who helped us out in terms of achieving our career goals and furthering our professional development who weren't being paid to do so. oftentimes individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have those options as well. Education. Regional centers are required to access whatever public education sources are available. So many times in some districts, there are opportunities for workability. And so the expectation is that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities participate in workability to the extent it's available to them. America's Job Center of California. As I mentioned, these organizations are fantastic and really have their finger on the pulse of what employment opportunities there are in each geographic area. And so to the extent that our individuals that regional centers support can participate in services through America's Job Center of California, we certainly encourage them to do that. And finally, the Department of Rehabilitation, which can provide an assortment of services, including job coaching to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So with that, I will turn it over to Denise, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. This is Denise, and I think they're going to give me the option of advancing the slides. So I can talk about a couple of new things that are happening in California. Last year, during the second special session, a bill was passed, Assembly Bill 1, that provided access to new funding for the developmental disability system through the Department of Developmental Services. I still can't seem to advance the slide, so maybe I'll have Myra do it for me. I don't want to pause too long, don't need some dead air here. Thank you, Myra. So the genesis of the new resources is really interesting to me, that the administration has discovered that if we want to make changes sort of from a top-down policy practice, then we need to measure what we want to change. And Amy already alluded to this, that we're trying to develop better measures of the outcomes we're trying to achieve, which is both competitive and integrated employment for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so there is a bill actually pending this year to help us improve that data so that we can keep better track of what's going on. When the Employment First policy was enacted, it highlighted that this was a special emphasis of the administration, that supporting individuals with disabilities, including those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, to achieve competitive and great employment was something that the administration was very interested in supporting with the support of the legislature. And so AB 2X1, or AB1 from the second special session, repurposed the managed care organization tax that was due to sunset and provided some additional new resources to the Department of Developmental Services to help support those Employment First policy goals. I'm thinking I might be able to do this now. So, oops, too fast. I don't want to lose anybody in the shuffle here. Nope, I guess, Myra, you'll have to go back one. Thank you. So the first program I want to talk about is that we were provided $20 million to support both these programs. One is a paid internship program, and the other is incentive payments to service providers who help individuals achieve competitive integrated employment. First, I'd like to focus on the internship program. The purpose of these funds is to pay the wages for individuals to participate in a paid internship. We can also use the funds to cover the employer costs, such as workers' comp insurance and taxes that are due, such as FICA taxes and that sort of thing. We were encouraged to develop this opportunity to lead to, hopefully, competitive integrated employment as the outcome of the internship. We know not all internships will lead to that, but it is hoped that a good number of these internships will actually lead to direct hires by the business and a competitive integrated job for the individual who had been an intern is now an employee of the business. We were required to develop this program with stakeholder input, so we held meetings north and south in our state to bring together over 50 representatives across the state from a variety of disciplines, including the adult education, community college system, to provide input to the department about what the guidelines should look like for the paid internship program. At the table during those stakeholder meetings were consumers and their families, service providers, regional centers, Department of Rehabilitation, the K through 12 system, the Employment Development Department, the State Department of Education, and headquarters with Department of Rehabilitation staff. We also are required to administer the program through community service providers, which means that the entity that will be funded to be the fiscal intermediary or the employer of record for the intern would need to be vendorized by the regional center to be able to do that. The law set a cap of $10,400 per consumer placed each year in an internship, and that would be each fiscal year, which in California is July 1 through June 30th. And the law stipulated annual reporting requirements from the regional centers to the department. So let me see if I can do this time. I think I need you to do it, Myra. My little button doesn't want to work. Thank you. So here's some of the data elements that are required by the law. They need to report, the regional centers would need to report to us the number of actual employment placements and internships, the type of employment placements and internships, the costs of the services that are used to support those internships, the hours each consumer works in either their internship or their job, and what the hourly wage of the consumer is. Those were actually specified in the law. And then there was another provision that was added to the law which basically said, and any other information determined by the Department of Developmental Services. We're not just going to arbitrarily add a lot of other data elements to this reporting requirement for the regional centers, but what we hope to do is have some conversation after we begin to collect some of this initial data to see if there are any other data elements that would be helpful to us as a system to improve competitive integrated employment outcomes for individuals with IWDD. Okay, Myra, the next one, please. So we have a second program that $20 million is going to fund, and this would be an incentive program for the providers who help an individual to achieve competitive integrated employment. I know this slide says to supported employment providers. That's what SEP stands for, but it's actually broader than that. The original law targeted supported employment providers, but the final version of the law expanded it to include other providers who help basically any regional center vendor who helps an individual to achieve a competitive integrated job. And then there are some milestones that are tied to each of the incentives. A $1,000 incentive is available when the individual's been on a job for 30 days. If they stay on the same job for 6 months, that would be a $1,250 incentive. And then if they're still in the same job for a consecutive of 12 months, then it would be $1,500. The regional center, again, is required to report to DDS the data elements that I had shared with you just a few minutes ago. Okay, Myra, next one, please. So I just wanted to show you this slide because I want to highlight what some of these effective partnerships help us to do as a system. In this picture here, you see 4 students who are actually students in the 18 to 21-year-old program here in Sacramento at the Sacramento City Unified School District. They participate in classes at our Sacramento City College, which is our community college here in the downtown area. And they are the ones who originally created the very first version of the PowerPoint that I use when I go around talking about these two programs, the internship program and the incentive payment program. And it has been culture changing for our department to have them here in our building, working in and amongst all of our employees, doing a variety of different tasks. They get high school credit for their internship work here in the department towards completing their certificate of completion or their diploma for graduation from high school. And in fact, the four that you were looking at, one of them, the first one there, Lawrence, originally thought he didn't want to be an intern in our department this year, but he's changed his mind and he's back with us again this semester, improving his employment skills. I also included my contact information in this, so if you downloaded the PowerPoint, you can go to these links and get a copy of the guidelines that were sent to the regional centers for the implementation of both of these programs. And I think there's one more slide. Oh, there's several resource slides. I think, Will, I think you were planning on talking to people about these. So with that, I think I'll turn that back to you.
So I don't know if there's something that Amy would like to say about the resource slides, but while she's coming on, I think we have the very first question, and the question is, will the competitive integrated employment incentives be paid to service providers doing placements for people with IDD who are referred to service providers from Department of Rehab? Should I read that again?
No, I just forgot I need to unmute before I talk. Sorry.
Great.
This is Denise. The SI incentive payments will be paid to service providers. It doesn't matter if they were referred from Department of Rehabilitation or any other source for that matter, as long as they are vendorized with the regional center to provide services. The incentive payments are actually added as a subcode to an already existing vendorization that the service provider may have. And so it is available to regional center vendors.
I love the next question. Can community colleges be supported employment providers, and what is that process?
Wow, that's a very interesting question there. I can see that Brooke asked that question. I don't know if there's anything that excludes them from being a supported employment provider, but under the law in California, in order to be a supported employment provider, there are specific requirements that need to be met. And one of those is that you need to be certified by Department of Rehabilitation as being able to provide the right services and supports. You would need to be vendored both by the Department of Rehabilitation and the local regional center, and that within 4 years of being certified by the Department of Rehabilitation, you would need to be accredited by CARF. And I believe CARF used to stand for something, but now it basically is just a word that it's an accreditation. It's a national and international accreditation agency. And our law is specific enough to see to require that it be CARF accreditation, not another type of accreditation. And I see Brooke has a follow-up question. So if not supported employment, is there another role for community colleges? There can be. I see quite a few options for community colleges. The first, I'm going to sort of back up just a tiny little bit. Amy touched on the competitive integrated employment blueprint, or what we've shortly just called the blueprint, or sometimes we call it the CIE blueprint. In that blueprint, there's a commitment from the 3 departments to provide the local entities, the LEAs, the regional centers, and the local DOR offices, some tools and resources to bring together local partnership associations to help you get into the same room together and figure out how it's best to work together in the local context. Not all communities are exactly identical. So we, as 3 departments, felt that it was really important that we allow the local partners to get together and develop what makes sense best for that local community. And community colleges can be part of those local coalitions. I would encourage you to approach either your DOR or your local regional center and express your interest in being included as part of those local partnership meetings as you develop how the entities in your area will be working together. There may be additional opportunities for becoming a regional center vendor to provide some of the other things that Amy touched on, like tailored day services, or maybe even a paid internship if the community college wanted to be the employer of record for a paid internship opportunity. And then, of course, that would make available if you helped someone transition from college to a competitive integrated job, the incentive payments would then become available as well. So I would get invited to those local partnership meetings, and then I would flip it around the other way. I happen to know that through the Adult Education Block Grant Program, there are local coalitions that are more centered around the community college system and the K-12 adult education system. And there are members of those coalitions who can bring partners to the table as well, regional centers, Department of Rehabilitation, and then the local service providers, the local adult supported employment providers and day program service providers and community integration program providers make really good partners for those coalitions. So you may want to consider, if you're a member of your local adult education consortium, inviting some of those partners to join your consortium. And then you can kind of expand the opportunities to everybody in your consortium. Sorry about the long answer.
Thank you for that response, Denise. I just want to push you a little bit on this last question, because we've discussed this a little about the role that the community colleges could play. If you could speak more to, you indicated that one of the roles community colleges can play is that they can help students to get work, volunteer opportunities, as well as to build their resumes, and that in having some sort of a work portfolio would help in terms of what references they can gather, an inventory of knowledge, skills, and abilities, those kinds of things. Could you speak to that some more?
Sure. So as Will sort of indicated, he and I had an offline conversation yesterday, I believe it was, a little bit about some of the things that might be important to the community colleges today. And the students who attend community college often will benefit from volunteer experiences, even paid work opportunities while they're still in college completing their curriculum and coursework, or their vocational training, or developing their foundational employment skills, whatever reason they're at the community college. Those other experiences are really important. What often is sort of lacking is then a portfolio that can be owned by the student that can explain all of their work history and experiences, what their knowledge, skills, and abilities are, what kinds of things they're interested in doing and good at, compiling things like letters of references, developing a resume, that sort of thing. I know that the Employment Development Department has put a lot of effort and resources into enhancing the CalWorks job site, which makes a really good virtual job portfolio. You can upload into the CalWorks site your letters of reference, your resume. There's even a resume building tool if you don't have one and you need one. And there's a way to inventory your knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then employers and businesses do the same thing. They post their jobs in CalWorks, and as part of that, they inventory the knowledge and skills and abilities that they're looking for in an employee to do that job. And the CalWorks software will allow an individual who's developed one of these portfolios to search those jobs that businesses have entered to see which ones they best match to. And it may be a job you didn't even think about because you didn't know you had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to actually do that kind of work. So if there was a way that the community colleges could assist individuals to begin to develop and learn how to maintain their own employment portfolio, possibly using the CalWorks job site if they want, that would be a really valuable resource to the individual going forward and a powerful tool for them in the job search process. Is that what you were looking for, Will?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
While I'm waiting for additional questions, please feel free to insert questions into the chat box. If you were to advise any community college as to what they could do tomorrow, say 1, 2, or 3 things that they could begin doing to take full advantage of the competitive integrated employment incentives, what would you suggest they do?
Are you talking to me, Will?
Yes.
Okay. So I would do a couple of things that I already just sort of talked about. One, I would invite some of these other partners like regional centers, adult service providers, Department of Rehabilitation to the adult education consortium in your area. Bring them to your table to be partners in the efforts that you guys are doing to really enhance and improve the adult education system in California, making a pathway for individuals through the education system that are really tied to the employment outcomes on the other end. The other thing I would do is I would contact either Department of Rehabilitation or even a local education agency or the regional center with whom you already have some sort of partnership and say you're very interested in being a part of the local partnership coalition that the regional center, the Department of Rehabilitation, and the LEA is going to put together as part of implementing the CIE blueprint. That you're interested in partnering with them and possibly becoming or exploring what roles that you can play, and maybe even at some point thinking about becoming a regional center vendor. Well, let me see now. A third thing, I would look at some of the resources that are available to help the actual individual consumers. I go out and tour that CalJobs website so you can see what kind of a tool and resource that could be. And if you haven't visited Disabilities 101, I would go visit that website as well. That has a benefits planner and a calculator in there. Many individuals with disabilities are on SSI or SSI, SSA combinations, or some people are on SSDI, and there are all kinds of calculators in it's called db101.org, where you can actually plug in potential earnings, and it will show you how it's going to impact and benefit you to have a job with regard to your state benefits. So I would go explore those things. So I would do 3 things. Invite them to your coalition, get invited to their local partnership, and look at those 2 web-based resources.
Thank you. I got a question from a parent who indicated that she has a 20-year-old son on the spectrum with autism spectrum disorder, and she said she was very interested in learning the roles of vendors, employers, and regional centers in implementing the Paid Internship Program. What could you share about that?
Does Amy want to jump in here?
Sure. So this is Amy. So the role of, can you repeat the question again, Will? I'm sorry.
Sure. So this parent is interested in learning the roles of vendors, employers, and regional centers in implementing the Paid Internship Program.
Of course. So starting with the role of the regional center, of course, the first role would be in the development with the individual's planning team of the IPP, the individual program plan. Next, as I mentioned, one of the roles of the regional center would be that resource matching, helping the individual to identify which service provider is the best fit for what they're looking to do. The service provider would probably assist the person to find a paid internship. So the regional center would match the individual with a provider, and then the provider would work to identify an employer for the individual. So the individual, would probably spend some time with the vendor, getting to know them, getting to know their preferences, getting to know their strengths, getting to know their interests, and would work with them to apply for internships or to identify an employer. And then the role of the employer would be to bring the person in as an intern. And there's different ways that the paid internship program that the funding can flow. As Denise mentioned, the person could be paid directly by the employer. The employer could become a vendor of the regional center, and the regional center could reimburse the employer for that person's participation in the paid internship program. Alternatively, the vendor could be the employer of record for the individual, and the vendor could pay the individual for participating in the paid internship program, turn around and bill the regional center, who would then reimburse them. Or there could be a third-party fiscal management service that could provide the employer of record services. But at the end of the day, it's ensuring that all these steps are coordinated and that we don't get ahead of the individual program plan. So first, it must be an identified goal for that individual in order to proceed.
Great, thank you. And how does one determine whether these services are already available in their community? Are these services already available across the state at each regional center?
So this is Denise. The answer to the question is they are available across the state, and they are in various stages of being implemented across the state. And it sort of depends on who raised their hand to to participate in these programs. Some regional centers have had more interest than others, and they've had more success in getting things set up and put into place. Other regional centers are still working with their local communities to actually get the first interns placed or the first incentive payments made. I'm suspecting that within the next couple of months or so, that sort of first round of startup will have been completed across the state, and those resources would then be available in each local area. Whether or not that meets the demand remains to be seen at this point. Things are so new. Not a lot of people know about these resources that are available, so we're still sort of in an educational mode. And at some point in time, regional centers may want to build additional capacity to meet the need if they have an increase in demand for these kinds of services. So I guess the answer to my question is yes, they're available statewide, and that we're still bringing them on board 100%. We're not quite there yet. I do know, though, that regional centers have a single point of contact, an employment specialist. Most regional centers have already hired a specific individual who is the employment specialist at each regional center. A few are in the last stages of hiring and putting those people in place. So if you don't know who to talk to at the regional center, you could reach out to the regional center and ask to speak with the employment specialist. Even if that employment specialist is still being brought online, there is somebody who is acting as the employment specialist in the meantime.
Thank you. So I've sent a question out to the participants. My question is, can you think of students for whom the competitive integrated incentives work, and If you can think of students for whom this applies, do you see any challenges? If yes, what challenges do you anticipate? And I'm waiting just a couple of seconds to see if someone will take me up on those questions. Okay, so the question is, a challenge is who will be the employers? Amy and Denise, you can both go at that one. Help us imagine and envision who the employers might be.
Okay, let's go alphabetical. Amy, I'll let you go first.
Thanks so much, Denise. I really appreciate it. So the employers would be anybody that would be looking to basically try out an employee and see if it's a good match. And, you know, we need to remember this isn't a program just for employers to see if this is a good match for them. It's also for the employee to see if it's a good match. You know, I think we all had at some point in our lives a vision of when I am ready to enter the workforce, here's what I want to do. And then I think a lot of us had the point where we got that first job doing what we thought we wanted to do and said, ooh, this really isn't for me. So this was an opportunity really for both the employer and the intern to see if it's a good fit for both of them. And it can be really any community employer. Denise?
Sure. I think that Amy's exactly right. It can be any employer, and I just want to highlight that we are in the process here at the state of developing an internship program for becoming state employees for individuals with IWDD. It's probably going to be rolled out on a statewide basis in the fall. We're working with CalHR to develop the process. It would be an alternative way to achieve state employment to our current exam process, which people with IWDD really have a difficult time navigating. Well, to be quite honest, almost everybody has a difficult time navigating it, but it's especially challenging for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that's something to look forward to. Also, the state is in the process of implementing one of Governor Schwarzenegger's, what do they call it when they sign an executive order? That's what he signed. We're in the process of implementing the one he signed in 2005 to become a model employer of people with disabilities. And this new internship program will hopefully be available statewide in the fall.
Okay, so we have follow-up questions to the question that was asked regarding who will be the employer, and the follow-up questions are, how do we create incentives for employers to take a chance with our students? Job development is a large piece of this puzzle. What efforts are being made on this behalf? So there are two questions there. How do we create incentives for employers to take a chance with our students? And the second is, since job development is a large piece of this, what efforts are being made to engage the job development piece?
So maybe I'll go first this time, Amy, and I'll let you tidy it up.
Sounds good.
So how do we create incentives for employers to take a chance with our students? That's part of the rationale for having the internship funding. We're hoping that a business who needs to hire people would consider hiring an individual with a developmental disability when if they're reluctant, that an internship may be a way to say, look, let us pay their wages while you train them and have a chance to evaluate that they're going to be a good match for you. And while they have a chance, the individual, the intern, has a chance to learn the job and demonstrate to you that this is the kind of work that they want to do and they're capable of doing. So that right there, we've been told by businesses who are interested in interns is an incentive to them. They get a chance to mold that employee the way they mold other employees while they're an intern, and the intern likes it because they get a chance to find out if they really like this kind of job and are really good at doing it, and they get to demonstrate their abilities to what is potentially their future employer. You're right in that job development is a large piece of this puzzle, and there are several different things that can be done to help with that. One is the new program that Amy mentioned earlier, which is those tailored day services. That's an opportunity to do sort of the initial exploration, what is often called discovery process with individuals prior to the formal job development taking place. We also know that Department of Rehabilitation is willing to be a partner in the development of internship opportunities as a pathway to a job for an individual. And so DOR may be willing to fund the job placement, job development services to get that going. So there's a couple of different ways to go about it there. Another way to do it is to invite your local Rotary Club and or Chambers of Commerce members to participate in some of your local coalitions, to have conversations with them about what kind of employees they're looking for, what sort of employment opportunities there are that they see coming down the pike that you can help prepare people to get ready for. And I believe the community colleges actually do a really good job of this sort of analysis of what is available in the way of employment in the local communities and what knowledge, skills, and abilities people need to have to be competitive for those jobs. If it's not located directly in the section of the community college in which you work, you may want to reach out to your career development folks to find out what they know, because they do some of this work in the local level. You can also reach out to your local employment development department, because EDD also does this kind of work. So your local workforce board, workforce development board, they used to be called workforce investment boards, but now they're workforce development boards, track this sort of thing at the local level as well. What jobs are coming online, what the knowledge, skills, and abilities are needed to be competitive for those jobs. So reaching out to your local job center may also be a way to help with this development piece. Amy?
Yeah, and I think you covered it pretty well, Denise. I think we need to distinguish this from the traditional internships that we see in education, where it's always that, where it's a much more formalized process. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about how many of us got our first jobs or the first lead on that first job through families or friends. And so employers could also be found through those routes. It's a little different than an unpaid internship in a lot of ways. And so, like Denise said, really getting people to take a risk on our folks this is the incentive. To be able to have that trial period where nobody has committed to anything long-term or permanent without the employer coming out of pocket is a really huge thing.
Thank you very much. We have additional questions. And the first one is, can a Department of Rehabilitation client who is not a regional center client participate in the incentive program?
So the answer to that question is no. The incentive program is specific for Department of Developmental Services clients, which are individuals who are supported by regional centers. So they would have to be a regional center client in order to participate in the programs.
Okay, next question. What if the employer keeps the person under $10,000 but never moves to directly hire the person? How long is this considered an internship reimbursed by Department of Developmental Services funds?
So the funds are $10,400 per person per fiscal year. And I suppose in theory, somebody could go from an internship one fiscal year and carry it over into a new internship the next fiscal year. That's actually not the purpose of the funding, and I would hope that the goals that are specific within the individual program plan for that individual is not to have serial internships, but that an internship would become a pathway to being hired. So if the business in which they're having an internship is not willing to hire the individual, then I would think that the program planning team would want to come back together again and say, okay, we need to move on from here and find a different opportunity for this individual. Amy, do you have a different take on that?
No, but I did want to piggyback on what you said a little bit, and it actually take it the opposite direction a little bit. Nothing says that the individual has to do their full $10,400 with a single employer. So it's not, once an individual starts an internship, it doesn't mean that they have to stay with that same employer if it's not a good fit.
Good point, Amy.
Okay, so Amy, while we wait for additional questions, do you want to say something about the resources that we are looking at on the screen?
Sure. So these were just really provided for your own information. There's some of the things that I covered related to the expectations from CMS, some information about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, a link to America's Job Center of California, and those kinds of things. So anything that I referred to in my presentation, I want you to have the ability to find out more if you wanted. And so if you download the presentation, these links should work for you.
So one almost natural question is, and I don't mean to put either of you on the spot, but some of the questions seem to suggest that it would help to see what this looks like in implementation or in practice. Are there some examples that you could point to that would help in that regard? Are there districts, are there regional centers that are already doing some of these things?
Gosh, that does put me just a little tiny bit on the spot because I haven't asked that question yet of the regional centers themselves. What I've been mostly finding out is where they kind of are in the process.
Sure.
That's why I was able to say that the majority of them have already begun adding these subcodes to existing vendorizations and are beginning to do the individual program planning meetings to get internships as part of individuals' IPP goals so that they can move forward with setting up authorizations for those things. What I don't know is if we actually have any interns out there already being funded this way by a regional center. I could find out though, and we can, maybe Amy can help with that, and we can maybe email a reply to you for that, Will?
Sure. And that is a very fair answer. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. I'm simply trying to serve as advocate because I think some are really trying to determine how they would implement these practices and how they could make that work within the context of the colleges and with their partners. Thank you so much for that answer.
Sure. I see that there's another question about splitting the incentive payments.
Right. So let me just read it all out just in case there's someone listening but not looking at it. Can the incentives be paid, or can the incentive payments be split between the parties involved?
So regional centers would need to identify the vendor that is responsible for assisting the individual to have achieved the competitive integrated employment outcome. Once that's done, that's the entity who would receive the incentive payments. If they believe that that opportunity was developed in partnership with other partners, they are more than welcome to share their incentive payments with their other partners. These are pure incentive payments, so they're not tied to any specific criteria around specific services that are delivered. So if, let's say the vendor ABC was sort of the lead in helping to get John a job, and to do that they relied on community college ABC to help, then vendor ABC would be more than welcome to share incentive payment money with community college ABC.
Great. Next question. So this question asks, paid internship program can also be used to start up micro enterprise employment. What are some of the things that the paid internship program can be used to pay for?
So maybe this particular questioner has actually already gone out and looked at the guidelines, because in the guidelines what we told regional centers is that the paid internship funding, which pays wages, can be used to pay a individual minimum wage plus cover workers' comp or taxes for that individual while they are apprenticing themselves to someone to teach them the ropes of starting up their own business. And it could be someone who works either owns a business of a similar type or is closely related enough that the individual could learn from this other small micro business owner how to run their own micro business, and they would be able to pay themselves essentially minimum wage while that was happening. I've talked with a couple of regional centers about this option, and they're mostly looking at using a fiscal management service to be the employer of record for this apprenticeship model.
I'm sorry, Easterbrook, we missed your question earlier, but it's a very important one, so I'll ask that question now. What do you suggest a service provider do while the local regional center is structuring their internship guidelines? And a follow-up, if the service provider is ready to develop an internship for a job seeker? Did you get the question?
I think I did. I'm going to let Amy take this one since I took the last one.
Okay, I'm a visual person, so I'm going to scroll back to that question. Hold on
sure,
for a moment.
As you know, thank you so much for pointing that question out.
Okay, what do you suggest? So I would suggest a couple of things for a service provider that finds themselves in this situation. As Denise alluded to, the implementation of the paid internship program is still being rolled out in most areas. And one thing that a service provider could do is potentially explore tailored day service as an option. It wouldn't pay the internship for the individual. I would also let your regional center know that you're interested in this, and find out what barriers there are and if there's anything you can do to help with that. You know, in talking with regional centers, this all sounds like a very simple concept on its face, but there are challenges around how to make the funding flow and things. This is a non-traditional service model, so it really does come down to giving people some time to work it all out. I understand there's a lot of interest in this, and this is great. But finding ways to engage the individual in some pre-vocational work service kinds of things in the meantime would probably be my suggestion.
Thank you so much. I see a message from Denise indicating that you can speak to the adult service provider question if we have time. Do you want to do that now? And then we have a couple more questions that are in the chat.
Sure. So one of the things that occurred to me when Will and I were chatting yesterday was that some of your students may already be connected to an adult provider and you may not actually know it. So you may want to have a conversation with your student to see if they have somebody who's supporting them to participate in their community college program, because some of the relationships and the support services that they need may already be readily available through that service provider who's already engaged with one of your students. So, and they're free, your students are typically adults and they're free to talk about who is working with them and is supporting them if they're comfortable doing that with you. And it may just help streamline things a little bit if you've got people who are pretty much ready to go and are thinking that they might like to participate in an internship. Not everybody has to do an internship. Some of our folks go through their programs, they go through their education programs. They're really quite ready to go, and they just need maybe a little assistance with job development through Department of Rehab, and kaboom, they go into competitive jobs. So, you know, it's an option, but it's not necessarily a requirement at all.
Thank you very much. Can an individual participate in other regional center or Department of Rehabilitation vocational services if they are participating in the paid internship program?
So this is Denise. There's nothing in the law that prohibits them from participating in other regional center or DOR vocational services while they're in a paid internship. I would imagine that the constraints would be how much time do they actually have to do anything else. Well, if they're, especially if their paid internship is nearly full time, and if they're still continuing to go to school as well, it may be more of a time issue than anything else.
Okay, so they are not mutually exclusive.
No, there's nothing in the law that requires they be mutually exclusive.
Great. Thank you. Does the competitive, I'm sorry.
This is Amy. I would just add that it's important to ensure that everything they're participating in is in alignment with their individual program plan and is directed towards some goal that's been identified that they have. So it may also come down to ensuring that ensuring that both programs would then meet a need of theirs and would be working towards achieving some goal.
Thank you for that. Our next question seems to be one of timing. It reads, does the competitive integrated employment have to happen after the placement source gets vendorized with their regional center in order to get the competitive integrated employment benefits? For example, we place 2 students in paid jobs and plan to get vendorized with our regional center. Can we still claim those placements or just placements from the time of vendorization?
Actually, this is a really good question, and I have some clarification from our upper management about this because we've been asked this question a lot. This really has to do with the backdating of payment for services as kind of what's behind this question. And there's a prohibition in our regulatory requirements that basically discourages regional center from doing back payments for services. However, the competitive integrated employment incentives are not a service. They are a pure incentive payment for having done a good job in helping an individual achieve a competitive integrated employment opportunity. So as the regional centers are comfortable in making those payments, they just can't go back any further than July 1st of 2016 because we didn't have the authority to do it until that date.
Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead, Amy.
And this is Amy. I would just add that I believe there's a regulatory prohibition on providing services before someone is vendored. So I'm not sure how that interplays. Have you guys taken a look at that, Denise?
Yeah, and again, that's tied specifically to services, and we're not worried about these incentive payments because they're not services.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
And we're actually going to have a conversation with our auditors around it so that they too are on the same page with us.
So from another source, but it seems like this question is related if it's not quite similar. If a provider is still in the process of being vendored to receive the incentives and to place the client in competitive integrated employment, once they are vendored, can they bill for retro incentive payment?
So that's kind of a straightforward question about the same thing, but yes, that would be allowable, but it can't go back any further than July 1st of 2016. So if the job placement took place, let's say it took place January 1st of 2016, then they would really only be eligible for the 12-month incentive payment, because we can't go back for the 30-day and the 6-month one that far.
Thank you for that response. In my introduction to this webinar, I spoke to accountability and some of the programs that the community colleges have implemented in order to sort of assist students with better outcomes, both academic outcomes as well as vocational outcomes. Could you speak, Denise, to how through the incentive programs you are able to assist the colleges with reporting on the outcomes once individuals are placed into competitive integrated employment?
Sure. So one of the things that is in the process of being developed is the data collection process from the regional centers regarding both the internship program and the competitive integrated employment program. We can look into the regional center purchase of service system and see how many and what types of these payments are being made and who they're being made to, and on behalf of who they're being made, which consumers they're being made. And if you're part of your local partnership with the regional center and you assist in the placement of an individual in competitive integrated employment, the regional center will be following them at least for 12 months, and that will help you also in collecting your outcome data at least for 12 months for the individuals that you are supporting as well. The tool that we create is probably going to be a very simple spreadsheet in Excel, and it will have a bit of demographic information and then the dates of when the 30-day, 6-month, and 12-month anniversaries of the competitive integrated job are. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I'm looking to see, thank you so much. I'm looking to see if it generates additional questions or not.
Okay.
And I'm sort of thinking about the loop. Community colleges serve a critical role in identifying the jobs that need to be filled in the community, and maybe some of the career education offices, if not all, are working with the EDD, Employment Development Department, to identify what courses and certificates need to be developed to address specific workforce needs. And I'm wondering if these services sort of help close that loop, in that after the students complete whatever the number of courses are, if they are placed in a job, if these incentives could then be used, and then in turn, because of your ability to provide data, sort of the college gets a good feedback loop indicating, good, we've successfully assisted that student into the community college environment through it, in that they completed the courses, and now there they go, they get that certificate and we place them in a job. Could you speak to that some more?
So I'm not exactly sure how it's all going to work in the long run, because we're still in the process of developing this, but part of the intent of the legislature in providing these additional resources is that we become a more data-driven, outcome-driven system. And so we're looking at what are the ways that people transition from education, which is where they typically are coming from, either K to 12 or some sort of adult education opportunity, into competitive integrated employment. What are the pathways that people are taking, and what supports are they utilizing along the way? That's part of the picture that we're going to put together in our reports, and we should get local reports from the regional centers that we can then roll up into sort of a, well, not a sort of a, but into an actual statewide report, so that we can report back to the legislature. But anything that we create that becomes sort of a statewide report in that fashion also has the granular detail that is helpful to the local people, including the community colleges, in managing their local processes. You should be able to look into your systems and see what coursework, what programs, what educational courses they did, what sort of services were provided to them by the community college that assisted them towards moving towards competitive integrated employment. And now you've got confirmation on the other end that they achieved competitive integrated employment as an outcome. That is an important closing of the loop for the community college system.
Thank you. We have another question. Do either of you know the end date for the sheltered workshops?
Wow, that's a little bit different way of putting it, I think, than I've heard before.
It is, but I'm wondering if you could, so take that question and then relate it or tie it back to our topic that we've been discussing and why all this is so important.
Sure.
So Amy, maybe you could chime in on this one as well. Thank you.
Well, the big target date for implementation of the new requirements from CMS for California is March of 2019. Amy, do you know if there's a specific date in March, or is it just by the end of March of 2018? 19.
I thought it was something weird like March 17th, 2019 is my recollection.
Okay, so it could be something really, really specific. So on that date, the federal government will no longer provide funding for site-based segregated services, which most of the sheltered workshops would be considered site-based segregated services. So between now and then, we need to do something a little bit different. We have a little under 10,000 consumers statewide who are in that particular type of service. Some of them are in sheltered workshop type services that are very traditional looking and are obviously sheltered workshop services. And then I know of at least 2 programs that are vendored that way still, but they certainly don't look or experience like a regular sheltered workshop experience at all. So, but that's the date, March of 2019.
And this is Amy. I'll just chime in a little bit more on this whole process. So as Denise said, the March of 2019 date is the date that at this time we expect that the federal government will require that all services provide higher levels of integration into the natural community. And one of the services that we think about as being particularly challenged in this area is the sheltered workshop. But in the meantime, what we as a state are doing, just like every regional center was given funding for an employment specialist, Every regional center was also given funding for an HCBS specialist. And this stands for Home and Community-Based Services, which is the mechanism that the federal government uses to pay for community-based services through the regional center system. And these specialists will be working with their community providers to help them to modify their services so that they can continue to receive federal funds. So we don't want to say that this means that all things that we consider sheltered workshops today will close their doors. But certainly this will be an opportunity, and this next 2-year period is an opportunity for them to examine how they provide services, maybe modify how they provide those services, and to come into compliance with the federal expectation around integration. So at this time, the state isn't saying that any particular class or any particular service is going to be expressly prohibited. The question is, how can every service that regional centers purchase, how can all of those services come into compliance with the federal expectation around integration?
Thank you. And I don't believe we have another question yet, but Denise, in our conversations, it seemed like you were sort of pressing the issue of integration or inclusion on the community college campuses. Could you speak to why that's so important in the light of the programs that we were sharing today?
Sure. So I had Amy was actually there too, but I had the pleasure of listening to Kristen Wright, who is the director here in Sacramento of the Special Education Division at the California Department of Education. And she shared with us her story, her personal story of her daughter, her middle daughter. She has three children. And her middle daughter was a child with disabilities, is a child with disabilities, and about their struggle as a family and supporting her in her integrated education experience, which didn't start out that way, but transitioned into that. And one of the things that she shared that really resonated with me and why I think this inclusion conversation is so important is that her child being included in the classroom was more than transformative for Kristen and her family and her daughter's educational experience. It was transformative for the school's experience and the other students and the other families who had students in that school. Everybody was transformed by being able to know and grow with her daughter as much as her daughter and their family was able to grow. The power of relationship and spending time together and learning from each other and supporting each other. And school environments are very much about learning how to support each other and be together as community. It's a real important time for people with disabilities to be able to participate with other students without disabilities. In fact, I think I even said to you, Will, most of us consider ourselves to be people without disabilities, but in reality, we're not people without disabilities. We're just temporarily people without disabilities, because the majority of people will at some point in their life experience disability, even if it's on a temporary basis or not. As we age and as things happen in our lives, many of us have an opportunity to experience what disability is like. How much more rich our lives would be if from the very beginning everybody is included in everything all the time.
Great, thank you for that. I would like to take this opportunity to thank both of our presenters, Amy and Denise, for sharing the wealth of your knowledge with the community colleges and our partners. And thank you for the many questions, participants, that you provided this afternoon. In the remarks on the chat box, I indicated that I would be delighted to help any of you figure out how this can be done on your campus. If you want to send me an email regarding your thoughts, aspirations, questions about how the internship incentives integrated employment incentives can be used either on your campus or in your community, please send me an email. And I can work with Denise and Amy to further address specific questions that you have that are local. So if you could please send me an email regarding that, that would be great. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Denise. And on my end, thank you so much, Myra, for sort of making sure that we were moving through the presentation today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.